The door from the yard swung inward on a gust of July dust and cool air from the reefer line, and Giulio Manfredi, Sergente Maggiore, felt both on his face at once, the panhandle's kiln heat and the freight car's winter breath. A mess line uncoiled before him like something rehearsed on a parade ground, steel trays clattering, coffee cascading in black ribbons, fat whispering on a flat top. He had learned to distrust smells in Tunisia, diesel, cordite, dead meat in the noon sun, but this was clean, indecently rich, and it tugged at memory older than war. Bacon, he thought, a word he had seen in English pamphlets and never once expected to meet in captivity. Cooks in white aprons moved like a section team loading and firing, griddles hot, timers in their heads, a sergeant behind them keeping cadence with a clipped, "Move it! Move it!" He wore US chevrons and a scar from a pre-war kitchen knife. The camp's tower lights blinked out as the sun cleared. Someone chalked the breakfast board with a neat hand, eggs, bread, milk, and beside it a posted sheet translated into 3 languages, the 1929 Geneva Convention, Article 11, rations equal to base troops. Law, not mercy, hung there like a flag. Giulio's boots stuck a little on the oiled floor. 2 guards watched without hurry, rifles at ease, muzzles down. In the corner, a walk-in reefer door, painted naval grey, breathed cold. The pan of eggs was deeper than a field latrine, industrial, shining, enough for a company with second helpings. Bacon came folded in wide curls, not the brittle scraps he had tasted once in a port canteen, and the grease slicked the ladle like cosmoline on a bolt. Bread smelled of warm sugar, butter sat in pats, actual butter, in a steel bowl of ice. He found his place between 2 prisoners from the old Ariete cruise who whispered that Americans must be tricking them, then fell silent at the first swallow. He chewed, and the old desert hollow in his stomach filled with heat. The mess sergeant caught his glance and nodded as if to say the schedule had been met. Outside, a switcher bell clanged and a coupling smacked home. The reefer lids would lift at 0900, the sergeant had told his team, not a minute earlier, because food did not arrive in this country by hope. It arrived by timetable, car numbers, and thermometers held to the light. Giulio filed past a posted notice on latrine sanitation and dishwater temperature he could barely pass. He understood the smell. He understood the weight of his tray. He took a second slice of bread and tried not to look grateful. When the guard tapped the sign again gently, it sounded like a gavel. At first light, the guard tower lamp clicked off with a metallic pop, and Lieutenant Marion Cole turned a page on her clipboard, ink already drying in the heat. She had been a WAAC instructor before they sent her here to make rules visible, latrine checks, kitchen audits, a running inventory that read like a battle diary. She moved along the boardwalk past the infirmary where enamel basins gleamed and a steam sterilizer ticked like a calm engine. The camp bakery exhaled a warm, flowery breath. Mixers thumped, dough hooks lifted pale ropes into trays, and loaves slipped from pans in ranks of 50. Her pencil found the figures: flour drawer, sacks at 100 pounds, yeast vials, salt by the quarter sack. In the motor pool, a corporal chalked reefer temps, 34 to 36 degrees Fahrenheit, logged every 2 hours, initials tight and square. Down by the spur line SS, Sergeant Walt Skillet Avery received the teleprint. Arrivals 0900, 2 reefers, consignments marked eggs, frozen, milk, canned, lard, 240 pounds, plus a surprise, citrus, case lots for the week's vitamin rotation. He hissed softly through his teeth, not displeased, and moved a crew like a platoon into place. No one hurried. Everything moved exactly fast enough. He had learned that in Chicago, kitchens where the dinner rush could kill you. The quartermaster timetable sat folded in his breast pocket like a field order. Giulio came off work detail, boots powdered with caliche, and lingered near the chalkboard as if learning a new alphabet. The menu read like a rumour you wanted to believe. Eggs again tomorrow, oatmeal on Wednesday, pancakes Friday. Beside it, Marion had pinned a translation of ration equivalents, the line that mattered to anyone who had starved. equal in quantity and quality to US base troops. A Red Cross inspector strolled the perimeter with a local reporter who kept peeking at his watch as if breakfast were a show. Avery opened the reefer and winter spilled out, a cool fog that made men smile in the heat. He signed the manifest with a pipe-stem pen, checked a carton seal, and thumped the carton corner with the same intimacy he reserved for a well-seasoned skillet. Marion ticked her boxes and added a sentence in the margin. Compliance excellent, sanitation good, morale steady. And when the reporter asked if this wasn't coddling, she simply recited the text of Article 11 and let the numbers carry their own voice. Julio stopped at the bakery door and watched bread tassels be brushed with milk until they shone. The sergeant caught his staring and jerked a thumb toward the mess line. Work made you hungry here. Law made sure hunger had a clock. The reefer door rolled shut with a seal that sounded like a promise you could eat. In town that afternoon, a filler headline slid into the county paper like a pebble tossed into a deep well. Italian women prisoners praise Yank breakfast. The copy carried no byline and borrowed a photograph from another post entirely, a neat braid tucked under a cap that looked a little too clean. The typesetter, hungry for ink to spill into a white gap, didn't know that the image came from a camp in Louisiana, and the subject wasn't Italian at all. The story rode the wire, got clipped and pasted, and found its way back to the camp through a snickering truck driver who held it up at the gate and said, "You boys seen your sisters?" Guards laughed, not cruelly, and waved him through. Marion accepted a copy, read it twice, and began a letter on government stationery that was half correction and half catechism. The prisoners here are men. Rations are lawful. The astonishment is real but misattributed, and accuracy matters because someday people will point to this and take a lesson. Anna Weiss, miles away and years later, would write in a clean, slanted hand about a morning that smelled of eggs and coffee and a sky too big to fit in Germany. Her sentences would be careful and human, and the names would be wrong, and a regional paper would glue the pieces together until a myth looked like memory. Back in Texas, Julio unfolded a letter from home, the paper thin as onion skin, ink blotted, the news tight and rationed. Coupons, lines, broth like tinted water. He looked at his tray that night. Meat, potatoes, a green vegetable that tasted of nickel and sunshine, and he ate slowly, trying to leave some for the man he had been. Avery, reading the paper over a mug, shrugged. "Feeds on time," he told his corporal. "Story or no story?" He had a reefer to unload in the morning and a sanitation chart to initial. The quartermaster's ledger didn't care about adjectives. It cared about pounds per 100 men and the boring miracle of repetition. Here is the impossible number that would have lodged in any Axis officer's throat if he'd seen it in a depot ledger. By 1944 to 45, the United States held egg reserves, frozen and dried, measured in hundreds of millions of pounds, enough for institutional menus to shrug at distance and weather. A single month's processing could dwarf what a hungry province remembered as plenty. That night the camp settled under a wind that smelled of dust and yeast, and the clipping on Marion's desk curled at the edge where the paste hadn't reached. She pressed it flat and finished her letter, signed, filed, and dated, a small act of defiance against the easy lie. Before dawn, the switcher's bell rang twice, and the spur line answered with a shiver that travelled through the rails, under the parade ground, into the mess hall floor. Avery stood with his hand on the reefer latch, feeling the metal sweat. "Thermometer first," he told himself, the way you look at a rifle's chamber before trusting the bolt. 32 at the car, 36 at the pantry. The chain could stretch across a continent only if every link knew its own temperature. When the door rolled open, Julio flinched as frost breathed across his knuckles, a clean ache that felt like forgiveness. The crates were stenciled EGGS-frozen, MILK-CANNED-FRUIT-CITRUS, and the seals were intact, wax perfect, twine unfrayed. Avery tapped each corner with a knuckle, counting without numbers. They worked as if loading ammunition. First in, first out. Powdered egg came in tins with tidy ratios on the lid. 1 part powder to 3 parts water yields 1 dozen eggs. The mess crew had learned to fold the mixture without breaking the foam, to let it sit while bacon hissed to keep the griddle just shy of smoking. Marion trailed with her clipboard and a stopwatch, logging car arrival at 08:58, offload complete at 09:13, pantry door sealed at 09:15, and the reefer dispatched back to the yard by 09:20. She added a note about citrus allotments for scurvy prevention, not because anyone doubted it, but because doctrine lived in ink. Julio felt the loop close. Yesterday he had filled lunch pails for a harvest crew, 2 sandwiches, an apple, a boiled egg, thinking of his mother's kitchen where such bounty would have meant a saint's day. Today he stacked tins that would become the gloss on tomorrow's cakes, a mess sergeant's quiet morale operation. He had come from armoured columns where M13/40 turrets squealed on dry trunnions and crews cursed the empty jerry cans. Here even the grease was plentiful. Avery showed him the pantry chart like a sergeant showing a recruit a field of fire. Delivery schedule, holding times, rotation marks in grease pencil on the racks. "We don't improvise breakfast," he said. "We deploy it." The word felt heavy and right. War had taught Julio that deployment was purpose plus schedule. Now he tasted a nation's ability to keep a promise 3 times a day. When they sealed the reefer, the rubber gasket compressed with a sigh, and the yard went momentarily quiet. Marion clicked her stopwatch, wrote 2 digits, and underlined them. Numbers could be mercy if you could keep them. Julio lifted a crate with the easy strength that had returned to his arms, and for a second the cold bit his palm and made him feel alive. The sign by the chow line was just paper and pushpins, but it had the gravity of a general order. Geneva, 1929, Article 11. Rations equal in quantity and quality to troops at the base. Marion read it aloud to a visiting civic club that came for a tour and stayed for an argument. They had ration books in their kitchen drawers and sons with APO numbers, and the old men among them remembered soup lines. "Seems generous," one said. Marion didn't smile. "It's lawful," she answered, "and it's loud." She meant that policy made a sound enemies could hear through rumour, inspection, and the unignorable weight gain of men who arrived hollow and left heavier. She flipped to a page that listed calories per man, protein targets, sanitation checks, dishwater temperatures, chlorination in parts per million. The quartermaster tables felt like scripture. Avery fielded the same complaint in the kitchen language he spoke best. He set a ledger on the stainless counter and ran a thick forefinger down columns that added like a march. Cost per serving, waste margins, variance within 5%, recovery plans if a reefer ran late. He had lived his life in kitchens where the difference between good and poison rode on small numbers, and he trusted those more than speeches. He explained powdered egg reconstitution and why you folded it gently. He explained why bacon fat strained through cheesecloth could give you 2 more pans without smoke. The club president listened and looked toward the line where prisoners selected 2 pats of butter without fear, then back at Marion's paper. Julio ate with a new caution, trying to understand intent as much as taste. When he wrote home that he had gained 6 pounds, he felt a pinch behind the eyes that he blamed on the onions in the beans. He had learned that American rules were not softness, but a kind of hard edge that stayed even when no one was watching, as if a country had decided in advance how it would behave during victory. After the tour, Marion folded her notes and slipped them into a folder labelled with the camp's name and the week's date. It pleased her that the archive would not care about voices raised on a summer porch. The mess line shifted, plates clinked. The smell of coffee carried into the yard, oil dark and medicinal. In the tower, a guard eased his rifle and watched the horizon as if rules lived out there too, beyond the wire. The club president took off his hat and said only, "If that's the rule, that's us." They ate under a windbreak of cottonwoods, where the irrigation ditch talked to itself, and the July sun hammered everything flat. Lunch pails opened like small metal vaults, 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, an orange, a boiled egg whose shell cracked away in neat chips. Giulio handed half his second sandwich to a shorter man from Bologna and watched the yolk wobble on his own palm, firm and golden, holding its shape like a coin. The farmer who had signed for the crew yesterday drove by slow in a flatbed and tipped 2 fingers from the wheel. His son was somewhere in the Pacific, the farmer said, and the crews worked on time, and the rows were straight enough to make a bishop weep. The word around the branch camp was that volunteers would be taken for Italian service units, now that the armistice made such things thinkable, non-combat labour under US officers. The patch would say Italy and sit polite on the shoulder like a visiting card. Avery's afternoon was cake, literally. Powdered egg whipped and rested, flour sifted fine, oven fans checked for evenness. He told his corporal that dessert was morale and morale was schedule, and then he quoted a quartermaster bulletin about vitamin supplementation and the rotation of leafy vegetables as if it were a song. The cake rose clean and took frosting without tearing. He sliced for the enlisted mess and made sure the POW trays carried equal portions. Sanitation checks passed with the soft click of a thermometer case closing. Dishwater shone at the required heat, a violent bath that left steel honest. Marion logged the day's outputs with a schoolteacher's patience and a combat officer's eye for rates. Pounds harvested per man-hour, accident-free shifts, consumption against forecast. She wrote a line about citrus saving men's gums and another about the new foreman's admiration for the POW crew's clockwork, then translated that slang into the more neutral, reliable. She had learned how words could outlive the work they described, and so she chose them carefully, not for beauty, but for staying power. Here is the impossible scale that would have read like a fable if it weren't stamped in cargo ink. 1 wartime month's American processing of eggs, frozen and dried, could underwrite breakfasts for prisoner populations larger than entire enemy corps, while Victory Gardens by the tens of millions backstopped the nation's palate with tonnage a continent away could not imagine. The country produced calories the way it produced liberty, messily, loudly, and in numbers that frightened ideologues. When the shift whistle blew and the crew rose, Giulio tucked his orange peel into his pocket to digest the smell later, the way you hold a photograph to make a moment last. He had begun to see breakfast as a doctrine you could swallow. September 1943 arrived on a crackle of radio static, and the barracks stilled as the news passed from mouth to mouth. Italy had signed an armistice. For a moment, Giulio Manfredi heard only the wind shoving dust against the walls and the slow creak of the guard tower ladder. The men of Ariete Division who had survived North Africa looked at one another without words. Some feared the label of traitor, others sensed a door opening. Before nightfall, a notice appeared on the camp board. Volunteers were wanted for newly formed Italian service units. These men would no longer be prisoners exactly, nor soldiers of the old regime, but labourers under US command wearing a shoulder patch that read simply Italy. SSG.T. Walt Skillet. Avery studied the order while stirring a pot of navy bean soup. He understood logistics better than politics, yet he saw in the patch an emblem of what the quartermaster already practiced, turning enemies into the machinery of supply. Marion Cole, called in to translate the directive, explained in careful Italian that ISU men would load cargo, build depots, harvest crops. They would remain under guard, and the Geneva rules would still hold, but their work would help win a war their homeland no longer wished to fight. Giulio walked to the sign-up table with his heart thudding like the reefer compressors. He thought of the M13/40 tank he had abandoned, its Breda machine gun silent for want of ammunition, and compared it to the humming American cold cars that never ran dry. This new patch would not erase his past, but it might secure a future. By dusk, the first roster carried more than 100 names. The next morning, Walt supervised a mixed crew of Americans and Italians unloading crates of canned milk and frozen eggs. He barked orders with a cook's economy, short, precise, measured, and watched former enemies lift together without hesitation. Marion noted the hour and the smooth integration in her log. The clang of metal on rail became a music of reconciliation. When Giulio stitched the Italy patch onto his khaki sleeve, the thread burned his fingertips, a small proof of choice. He looked across the yard at the rising dust and felt the weight of a new allegiance, not to a flag of empire, but to the idea that law and abundance could be stronger than fear. Spring 1945 brought a different kind of tension. Across America, posters flapped on telephone poles urging civilians to tighten belts and stretch ration books. Even in Texas, the strain showed. Sugar shipments slowed, meat coupons ran thin. In the camp, rumour spread that prisoner rations would be cut. Giulio remembered the empty bellies of Tunisia and felt an old dread crawl up his spine. Walt Avery faced the challenge like a battlefield cook. A quartermaster bulletin warned of temporary shortages and urged strict waste control. He gathered his crew before dawn, voice clipped as an NCO briefing a patrol. Every ounce of bacon fat to be strained and reused, every heel of bread accounted for. Marion Cole, clipboard in hand, tracked the variance, no more than 5% allowed by War Department standard. For the first time since Giulio's arrival, breakfast plates looked thin. He swallowed his portion and tasted memory more than food. Letters to the editor accused the army of coddling its captives while Americans tightened their belts. Marion filed each clipping with quiet precision, adding her own notes on Geneva obligations and the moral calculus of keeping faith even when supplies pinched. Her report moved through channels like a quiet alarm. A late-night telegraph from the depot promised relief. A reassigned refrigerated car loaded with frozen eggs and lard, diverted from a surplus port stock. Walt rode out in the dark with a 2-truck convoy to meet it. The reefer door hissed open at 0200, a breath of winter in the warm Texas night, and he checked the thermometer. 34 degrees, within spec. By dawn, the griddle sang again, bacon curling like victory banners. Giulio tasted the return of plenty and felt the tension ease. He watched Marion's pen move as she recorded the restored calorie count, 3,000 per man per day, back to standard, and understood that in this country numbers were not just measures, but promises kept. Scarcity had flickered like a failing light, and then the system corrected itself. Night settled cool and sudden on the panhandle. A reefer door rolled open with a metallic sigh, and white breath curled into the dark, the scent of cold milk sharp as steel. Giulio hefted a crate stenciled milk, canned, and felt its weight settle like a fact. He was feeding the machine that fed him. Around him the Italian service unit worked in rhythm, boots scuffing ballast, laughter low and companionable. On the loading dock a farmer's daughter lingered with a camera, curious about the men who had once been enemies. She traded Giulio a snapshot of her 4-H calf for a GY chocolate bar. The chocolate, stamped with the quartermaster's plain block letters, broke with a clean snap. To Giulio, it tasted like a treaty signed in sugar. Walt Avery watched the exchange from the cab of the switcher and smiled without comment. He knew that a single wartime month of American chocolate production, measured in thousands of tons, could outstrip what the Axis managed in a year. The same industrial muscle that poured eggs and bacon into POW camps also wrapped sweetness in foil and sent it to every corner of the earth. Anna Weiss, far away in Louisiana, began to draft her memoir. She described a morning of eggs and coffee and a sky too wide for Germany, and she misplaced the camp's name. Years later, a regional paper would misread her account and braid it into the rumour of Italian women POWs astonished by American breakfasts. The legend would endure because its core was true: abundance astonishes. Giulio slipped the photograph of the calf into his pocket beside a folded letter from home. He felt the chill of the milk can against his knee and understood that he had become both witness and participant in a system whose strength lay not in weapons alone, but in the quiet certainty of supply. Walt Avery sharpened a pencil and drew it along the ledger's edge as if sighting a rifle. Columns of figures marched in ranks more disciplined than any parade. Pounds of eggs issued, gallons of milk consumed, miles of refrigerated rail run each week. Marion Cole stood beside him, compiling her own briefing. The numbers startled even her seasoned eye. The United States held egg reserves, frozen and dried, measured in hundreds of millions of pounds at wartime peak. Victory Gardens, more than 20 million strong, produced tonnage that cushioned the nation's appetite and ensured POW rations never wavered for long. Across the country, roughly 425,000 Axis prisoners, including some 51,000 Italians, ate to the same standard as American base troops. Giulio listened as Marion explained that these ledgers were not mere accounting, but a form of strategy. The cold chain from Midwestern farms to Texas mess halls functioned with the precision of an artillery timetable. Trains of refrigerated cars, thermometers checked every 2 hours, delivered protein with the reliability of sunrise. Walt closed one ledger and opened another, noting a week's throughput of powdered egg tins, each with the simple ratio, 1 part powder to 3 parts water, that had become as much a weapon as a rifle. He recalled the nights when a single Chicago packing plant produced more bacon in 24 hours than the entire Italian army could have requisitioned in a month. Giulio absorbed the statistics in silence. He had once believed that victory belonged to the boldest attack. Now he saw it belonged equally to the quiet mastery of logistics. The ledger's final column totaled with a neat stroke. To Giulio, it sounded like the closing of a steel door on the old world, and the opening of another that would not be shut. Years later, in an archive reading room that smelled of paste and dust, Marion Cole pressed a brittle clipping flat under glass. Italian women prisoners praise Yank breakfast. Beside it, she placed her own wartime memorandum correcting the record. The misprint had travelled farther than the truth, syndicated in small papers and retold at kitchen tables until it hardened into local law. Anna Weiss's memoir, careful, heartfelt and slightly blurred, had supplied the spark. She had indeed tasted American eggs and coffee under a Louisiana sky, but her nationality and camp had shifted in memory and in the hands of inattentive editors. The story fit too neatly to be questioned. Enemies, women no less, marvelling at bacon and eggs while their country burned. Giulio, long returned to his village in northern Italy, told a simpler story. He spoke of the morning he first smelled bacon on a Texas wind and how the Americans fed their captives like soldiers. He told it not to flatter his former captors, but to remind his neighbours that a nation which kept faith with its own rules could not be beaten by force. Marion wrote a final footnote for the Historical Society. She explained the misattribution and defended the deeper truth. American abundance had been a weapon more persuasive than any bomb. She closed the folder with the satisfaction of a soldier who has kept the field after the guns have fallen silent. The myth endured, a ribboned rumour that captured the essence, if not the detail. In that persistence lay its own lesson. Facts can be bent, but the power of plenty is not easily forgotten. The pier smelled of salt and creosote when Giulio stepped onto the gangway in early 1946, heavier in body and spirit than when he had crossed the Atlantic as a prisoner. Cases of eggs and flour rolled past on dollies, abundance escorting him even in departure. He carried in his pocket the photograph of the farmer's calf and the foil wrapper of a GY chocolate bar, small relics of a country that had conquered without cruelty. Walt Avery, now demobilised, watched the same port a week later as civilian dockmen unloaded crates stamped with the brands he knew by touch. He was headed for a booming post-war food industry, carrying with him the quiet doctrine that systems win wars, cold cars, ledgers, and the discipline of feeding both friend and foe. Marion Cole signed her final report before returning to civilian life. Mortality among US-held POWs held to fractions of a percent, rations equal to those of base troops, compliance with Geneva standards documented beyond dispute. Her conclusion read like a strategic briefing. Logistics is ideology made visible. To feed an enemy is to proclaim your confidence in victory. Giulio looked back once from the ship's rail. The camp's towers were far behind him now, but the memory of bacon hissing on a Texas griddle remained sharper than the crack of any gun. He understood that America's strength lay not only in the millions of rifles and the thunder of its factories, but in the quiet certainty that it could afford generosity. The mess hall lights of Camp Hereford clicked off for the night as another reefer door sealed with a muffled sigh. A generation's quiet conviction that breakfast, done right, could help win a world, settled into history like the last tray stacked in the kitchen rack.